Professor Anita Hill and Professor Richard Wolff. It's our Professor Day. Professor Richard Wolff is the economist, co-founder of democracyatwork.info, the author of numerous books. His most recent, The Sickness is the System, When Capitalism Fails to Save Us from Pandemics or Itself. It's also available now as an ebook, democracyatwork.info, rdwolff with 2fs.com, and Prof. Wolff on Twitter. Professor Wolff, welcome back, and thank you so much for joining us again. I'm curious your thoughts on this whole debt ceiling debate and what's going on. And I know the history of this goes back to World War I. This was put into law to try to appease the people who didn't want to go into World War I or were reluctant to see it as an open-ended conflict, so that there could be some essentially regulation of our ability to spend into a war. And it just stuck around. And then also this story that Axios is reporting, that if the Republicans blow this thing up, the Treasury could just mint a couple of $1 trillion coins and pay down some of the debt that way. Tell us your thoughts on all this.
Okay. It actually goes back very, very far, because if you think about it and you go back centuries, it has always been tempting in societies where there is money for whoever runs the society, the king, the czar, the emperor, to get over hard times and difficulties by basically printing money, making the coins and printing the bills and getting out of a difficult situation. Politicians, want to please everybody by spending money on projects, and they also want to please everybody by not charging them taxes to pay for it. And the only way to pull off that miraculous trick is to print the money yourself, because then you can spend it without having to raise the taxes. But of course, the problem then becomes, what's the limit? If the money keeps being printed and it prints more than there's goods and services around, well, then you're going to get that classic inflation, too much money chasing after fewer than that in the way of goods and services. So that's a fear. People don't want the inflation. So the solution was to put a limit on what the sovereign could spend. You did that in a parliamentary way by creating a Congress or things like that had to go along with the president. But then there were always those moments when you really needed to stimulate the economy with lots of money, and when the politicians couldn't dare tax people, well, then they reverted to the money printing. And then they did it sometimes indirectly by not allowing the president here in the United States to do it, but by setting up this quasi-independent thing, which in other countries is called the central bank. In our country, it's called the Federal Reserve, and making them go through a bit of a ritual so that you can't let the president directly create money, even though indirectly he can get the Federal Reserve to do it for him, which is exactly what Obama did, what Trump did, and what Biden is doing now. Well, the Republicans like to position themselves as the keepers of the flame, the ones who are making sure that the terrible inflation won't come, et cetera, et cetera. So they denounce spending beyond whatever the cap is that we have on it at any given time. They've done that over and over again. It's good publicity for them being watchful guardians and that kind of ritualistic posturing for the press. In the end, it is so dangerous for the United States not to pay its bills. And that would be what would happen if you don't let the government borrow. For example, this year, the government is scheduled to spend $3 trillion more than it takes in taxes. It has to borrow that. In order to borrow that, it has to go over the current cap, and that's what they're discussing raising so that they can borrow. If they don't, the government is going to have to decide to whom it sends the famous letter, sorry, we were expecting to spend on you, but we're not going to be able to, thereby crushing whoever the sectors are in the society who expected to have that money spent on them. That's politically difficult, and so the game between the Republicans and the Democrats is who is going to have the fun of posturing as the great guardian, who is going to be in the hot seat of denying people the money that had been promised and expected by them. And that's really all this is. About the $1 trillion thing, that's a threat. That's the threat of the Democrats against the Republicans. If you don't raise the cap so we can't borrow, we're going to do a magic trick. The Treasury is going to create a coin, say that it's worth $1 trillion, give that to the Federal Reserve as collateral, and then the Federal Reserve will simply set up an account for the U.S. government of $1 trillion, which they can then draw against in giving everybody the check. These are simply detailed, holistic maneuvers while the two sides play around with what? Well, here's the big news. We are an economy that's on life support from the Federal Reserve. Our economy doesn't work anymore, and the government has to spend way beyond what it raises in taxes to keep it going. And the Federal Reserve has to pump more money in than ever before to keep it going. For a while, that worked. But now they can't undo what they've already done. They dare not stop the dependence of the economy because we're like an addict. You cannot suddenly stop the flow of heroin because you plunge the addict into something that could, at the very least, wreck his life, at the worst, kill him. And we're like that now in this economy. Nobody knows what to do. We've never been in quite this situation before. And what you're watching is an endless gimmickry as the people in charge try, on the one hand, to position themselves for political points, and on the other hand, look at each other blankly, not knowing what to do with the situation we've gotten ourselves into.
Yeah, it's a tough one. The 14th Amendment says that the debt of the United States shall not be questioned. Does that, in the circles, the economist circles that you travel in, and the political observations that you make, do you think that there's any chance that this administration might pull that out and say, we're just going to keep on writing the checks, and if somebody wants to sue us, go ahead, but we think we'll win before the Supreme Court because we believe that this debt limit, this debt ceiling law that was passed back in 1918 or whenever it was, is unconstitutional?
No, that's a level of political honesty I really don't think they're capable of. Yeah. They're going to maneuver around it. They're going to issue these coins. They're going to come up with a lot of double talk. They're going to ignore this because, in fact, it's not a question of what the Constitution does or doesn't say. The whole world depends on the U.S. dollar as what's called the reserve currency. It's what banks hold to prove to the world that they're solid, that they're solvent. Look, we have this reserve in the form of a dollar. Nothing else plays that role. Maybe the Chinese yuan will in the years ahead, but the euro certainly is not able to. The Japanese yen stopped being able to even pretend to try to do that. So if the United States were actually to default, it would shake the confidence of the entire world financial system. Even that we might survive were it not for the fact that the capitalist system we live in is on life support now, cannot possibly survive such a shock. Everybody in the game knows it. So the United States has to, basically. But here's the problem. You're stuck. Like, they can't raise interest rates, even though they know they should, because we're such an indebted country that the businesses, the government, and the individuals cannot service the debt they already have if the interest rates went up. So the very thing you did to solve the problem created a new problem, which is even harder to solve. This is an economic system that is desperate now and that is casting about for one gimmick after another to keep it all going. And this is a story that it is easy to say will not end well. And I might give you a footnote. Dr. Nouriel Roubini, who was one of the few who predicted the crash of 2008 and 9. He's a business professor at the Stern School of Business in New York City. He has been back in the news saying exactly what I am saying to you now, that we have waltzed our way into a economic dead end, and the game of the politicians is mostly to pretend that that's not the case, even as it gets worse.
I've read in a couple of different places over the years, but I've never seen quantified the argument that had Reagan not cut taxes the way he did, when Reagan came into office, the national debt was $800 billion. When he left, it was $2.3 trillion. So he tripled the national debt in 8 years. And most of that was his tax cuts. And had Reagan not cut taxes, and then to compound that, had George W. Bush not cut taxes by trillions, and then to triple compound that, had Donald Trump not cut taxes, that we would still have a national debt on $1 trillion, and we wouldn't be having this conversation. Do you know if anybody has ever quantified exactly what the economy would look like had those 3 very consequential Republican tax cuts in the last 40 years never happened?
Over the years, I have read, I wish I could bring them to mind, I can't, but I have read a few articles that made, let's call it, partial attempts to do what you just asked about. And indeed, one article I remember about what Bush did, another article about Reagan. I'm not sure whether we have that kind of thing about Trump, but my guess is we do. But we shouldn't be surprised. What you're seeing is the Republicans found a politically viable way to survive as a party. They became the party that was going to deliver to the American people something really phony, but it sounded good. We'll cut your taxes.
The tax cut Santa Clauses.
That's right. Tax cuts, Santa Claus. People were squeezed in American capitalism for the last 40 years. They wanted some relief. Being told that here's a party that will at least not raise your taxes, but maybe even cut them, that offered some kind of relief. The logical question, what happens if they cut taxes to the services you rely on, to the state of the economy? That carefully was avoided as a question the Republicans felt they needed to answer. And so you had this crazy politics of Republicans saying, I'm going to cut your taxes, Democrats saying, I'm going to give you a new program or spend more money on you. The compromise between these two, we know only too well. The Democrats acceded to the Republican tax cuts, and the Republicans acceded to the Democratic spending increases, with the result that our deficits, as you just summarized, went crazy. But that's not really a solution, because the rising levels of debt and the need to service the debt, that produces the increase in the money supply, the role of the Federal Reserve to keep it all going with endless money creation. So now you have a new problem. But, systems, when they start to go down, that's what they do. The example to see it clearer is Britain. They were going down for many of the same reasons, and they invented, the conservatives over there, the equivalent of the Republicans, they invented the fantasy story, it's all Europe's fault. If you vote to leave Europe, everything will get better. It got them into office. It keeps them in office. England is in worse shape than it's ever been, and they're just looking for the next gambit to play.
Yeah, it's amazing. Professor Richard Wolff. democracyatwork.info. Professor, thank you so much for dropping by. Great talking with you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Always a pleasure.